Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer, and Vern Anderson, our engineer. Joining us this hour is a gentleman who in the past spoke with us as his role as a senior fellow at the World Watch Institute. Erik Assadourian directed 5 editions of The State of the World, which I did every year, and 2 editions of Vital Signs. And as a researcher, he studied consumerism, corporate responsibility, sustainable communities, education, global security, global sustainability indicators, ecological ethics, and religion's role in sustainable development. The last time we were together, we spoke about their State of the World 2017 EarthEd, Rethinking Education on a Changing Planet. He had authored the introductory chapter and the final chapter, talking about global education being redefined by the needs of our time. Now he leads groups taking shape around what is called Gaianism, a philosophical path through an ecological unstable time. Erik joins us this hour to discuss his own trajectory into finding a Gaian principled movement building on efforts like deep ecology and James Lovelock's Gaia theory to better give us and our families and our societies the tools we need to keep our Earth and to restore our Earth and live sustainable lives. He joins us for a lively discussion of how to do these kinds of things in our lives and what he's doing with his own family in this direction. Thank you for rejoining us, Erik. It's been quite some time.
Yes, thanks, Joe, for having me.
Well, one of the things that attracts me to you year after year, and in the past the World Watch Institute itself, is that you're an action person as well as a visionary, and they don't always go together. Sometimes visionaries see the future, but they don't do something. So I was fascinated to find out in preparation for our chat this evening that one of your projects was a reality TV show made in collaboration with Big Mouth Productions that ran for 4 seasons starting in 2014 called Yard Farmers. I mean, this is an example of a visionary moving into action. Talk to us about that.
I would love to, although I have to correct the record because
okay.
We tried to make it go.
Oh, okay.
I did a lot of reading on trying to do reality television, and one of the lessons from even the biggest kind of producers and directors is that a lot of it's luck getting it produced, and especially on a topic like this. So, but we got further than I had expected, truthfully, considering the topic. The topic was not just yard farming, right? But I mean, everyone likes kind of local gardening and that kind of thing. But ultimately, it was a little bit subversive, right? The idea was to bring millennials back home to live with their parents in often oversized, from a global perspective, homes. The average American household has 2,400 square feet, and that's usually for 2, maybe 3 people. And so that's too much space for a family, considering the ecological impact of that space. And there's large yards, and most of the yard space is just for lawn, which is actually the 4th largest crop by acreage in the United States. So how could we take all that unproductive space and start producing local food, which could help reduce the obesity epidemic, which could build local resilience as global supply chains are disrupted by different challenges that we're facing, and actually create a non-consumer livelihood path for those households, right? So, I mean, in the peasant era, people had multiple types of revenue stream, which was much more resilient. Not just not just having a trade, but also growing some of their own food and all of that. So it was an attempt to really move us away from the consumer era and make it, and speak in the American language, right? Make it fun and sexy, and have young people from around the United States come back home. And
I thought it was a great idea. Now I see why I thought you did it. You were writing from the future, reading back, and I thought it was actually a true statement that these things had happened. But it's a brilliant idea, and who knows, maybe at some point someone else will see the wisdom in it, because, forming community, as you point out, and building resilience into the local economy, there's really nothing more important right now for any of us to be doing. I always say that, to whomever is listening, to focus on your local community's economy, networks, and support systems, because, as you point out, the planet is changing fast. And you write, from a human perspective, quote, you could even say the Earth is dying, but of course switching to a hot state where the tropical forests and coral reefs disappear, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is, our responsibility is to do as much we can to improve life on Earth and to restore ecosystems and to live with the changes we know that are upon us and to prepare for them properly. When you launched this effort at Gaianism and sort of the Gaian philosophy, talk to us about what your basic thought line is and what you hope to accomplish with this.
I would love to, and just to give some perspective, because it's very different than the 18 years of researching that I was doing at World Watch. But I actually came to World Watch as a research intern right out of college, pretty much, after having studied psychology and religion. And the director of research at the time wanted to understand the religious community's role in moving us toward a sustainable future. And he was focused more on the ancient traditions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, that kind of thing. And, I got a chance to study that, as you mentioned, sustainable community building, the localizing economy and all of that. And whatever I studied was always too little too late. And I don't know if that's just because I was writing in 2000s, right? And it was actually Dana Meadows back in the 1970s who wrote about the limits to growth. And if we listened to her and to other luminaries back then, or visionaries, then we might have been able to get to a sustainable future without the terrible transition that's going to happen in the process now because we've waited so late.
Mm-hmm.
But the environmental movement right now, someone once said, I think Martin Palmer, when actually comparing it again to religion, he made this point that environmentalism is like religion or church without the joy, the community, the celebration, all that. It's just the guilt, the dark side, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's because we're so worried about the future that we forgot or didn't take the time to build community,
mm-hmm. That's an interesting
find
point
that
of
higher
view.
purpose and higher calling and the joy from serving that higher calling.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, this is kind of an inevitable process, right? I've written about the changes we need to make. I don't feel supported in that, in a sense, and I want to build community around this because, my grand purpose, or, all of ours, I would argue, is to recognize that we're part of a living Earth and dependent on it. And if we don't restore it, take care of it, yes, but really restore it because we've done so much damage, then our future is already written and it's not a good one.
I think your perspective is a fascinating one because I think I have suffered from ecological depression my entire life. Truthfully, because I started as an activist at age 14, handing out flyers in Southeast Baltimore for a talk on acid rain being given by Ralph Nader. And I, like you and many others in our audience, or those, who listen online, have spent a lifetime trying to remind people that the air we breathe is shared air and we shouldn't be dumping oil in our waterways and destroying our land and, destroying our seed bank and et cetera, et cetera. And you're right. I think that there is a great deal of sadness about the state of affairs because so many of us were wide awake from the 60s until today and tried to convince the rest of the world, wake up, stop what we're doing. And that was unsuccessful. And so now we have much younger people who will inherit such a difficult challenge with an Earth coming undone, with species decelerate, with species extinction, ours and theirs. And I think your perspective and Gaianism is such an important addition to make so that there is some hope.
Well, thank you. And you're right. You see more and more articles about ecological anxiety or ecological depression, as you called it. And in fact, some of the stories, Greta Thunberg, she kind of went through this non-speaking phase before she's become this icon of youth climate movement. There was a while where she went into a deep depression when she learned about climate change for the first time. Mm-hmm. And she's not alone, right? There are so many people who are struggling, and imagine if they had a community of people who understood that, rather than most families who, my own family and friends, when I describe the changes that are coming, some of them are environmental friends, but many of them don't understand what I'm talking about. And that's a little alienating. And having a community that can support you and that you can help support is important now, and it's actually going to become even more important in the future as we do face more emergencies and as we need local support as systems break down, and we can't expect government services are always necessarily going to be available. No, so having that community is going to be important.
Well, and I think I shared some stories that during the hurricanes in Texas a few years ago, the communities that did the best already had CSAs, community-supported agriculture. They had soup kitchens. They had food pantry networks. They had already established community associations that were able to come together as soon as the storm was over to start helping each other. And we see that. You even speak to, that the Mormons keep at least a 3 months, some several years, it depends on who you speak to, pantries. And we've become a 24/7 shopping civilization without a whole lot of thought of what happens. When you have no services, I look at Puerto Rico or other places, and you can see what happens when government abandons you or just is too overwhelmed responding to specific things and can't really take care of the general need of the community with electricity and water and food. So the Gaian philosophy, talk to us more about that and its roots in deep ecology and James Lovelock's early work.
Yeah, well, so I think for me, as I learned about deep ecology, and deep ecology was you mentioned visionary in action, right? This was a visionary set of writings in the 70s by Arne Naess, an eco-philosopher, and he argued that we all need our own ecosophy. It never was a good word, but ecological philosophy. Uh-huh. And he had his own kind of top 10 list of 10 tenets, and they were good, but he was arguing that everybody needs to make their own, right? So he did the fundamental opposite of what philosophical, if you look at the most successful philosophies in history, they're missionary philosophies, right? There's a fine line between religion and philosophy, and ultimately Gaianism is a philosophy, but then again, so are all religions. And so I would argue that Naess, with deep ecology, was really saying we need to take care of Gaia. He didn't have that terminology yet because that was after his time, and he didn't. And just like Aldo Leopold, who argues for the land ethic and taking care of the land and all that, there wasn't that rooting in Gaia theory where Lovelock comes along and says, the Earth is actually a living superorganism. When you look at the data, it doesn't make sense that it's just the sum of all the parts, right? But it's actually, an emergent phenomenon, just like consciousness is an emergent thing. It's not, you can't point to one part of the brain and say it comes from here, but it's the emergent property of that whole system. So Gaia, I would argue, doesn't have to be a supernatural concept. And I think ultimately it's a spiritually moving concept, the idea of us being connected to it. But it's a living entity. And for me, personally, it becomes essential that I devote myself to serving that living entity, meaning healing it after centuries of the wrong path that humans have developed.
Well, and I like your creed. I'll just read a little bit of it, and then we'll take a break. We believe that the Earth Gaia is a living being, that Gaia is at the same time composed of the vast diversity of life and is alive in her own right. We understand that we depend completely and utterly on Gaia and are part of Gaia. We recognize that current human actions are fundamentally altering Gaia, and that if pushed too far, Gaia will shift from her current state to one inhospitable to humans and millions of other species, unquote. And this is why each one of us committing ourselves to doing the right thing and helping our children get educated and grandchildren educated in the right way for what's really needed at this time is what you've spent so much of your life doing. If you're just joining us, Erik Assadourian is our guest. You can learn more about his ongoing posts and efforts at www.gaianism, GAIANISM.org. That's gaianism.org. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Erik Assadourian is our guest. He is a post writer. He's a blog writer as well as a visionary and activist. And I love what he's doing. We met through World Watch Institute years ago. And today he is leading a movement called Gaianism, www.gaianism.org. So, Erik, when we spoke, you had a very young son who was a toddler at the time. He's a little bit older now. And that was one of your own motivations, as you described to us then, in really rethinking your own life. You know, as you say, what's the best thing we can do for our kids? Let them watch 4 hours of TV a day like the average American? Or are we going to give them skills they'll need to stop the ecocide or at least survive ecological transition?
Absolutely. You're right. He's much older now. He's not much, but he's 7.5.
That's older.
And it's great. I mean, I homeschool him along with my wife. Together
right.
Which is, highly recommendable, not doing it all yourself, but sharing it.
Yeah.
But so then he gets a different set of skills from each of us. In fact, when I was just about to be a father, I asked someone, what he thought was the most important skill to make children resilient for the future, and he actually said languages. He didn't even hesitate. He was, of course, European, where languages are really, really, celebrated and valued. But luckily, my wife, is trilingual, so she's kind of got that field, and I'm doing a lot on giving him the outdoor skills that are valuable. Together, we put the most important emphasis on moral education and social emotional skills, and also once we moved to Middletown, where we live.
Oh, wonderful community! That is a wonderful community.
It's a great city in Connecticut, and we found a great dojo. So together, we're learning karate in a
lovely
dojo that actually teaches children and adults together. So
one of the things we talked about, and that last report you did for the World Watch Institute on the state of the world and the educational system, is we talked about the outdoor education going on in the forest schools, the nature schools. I think there are like 150 that are certified now in this country, maybe more.
Yeah. They're great, and it was out of my reach in D.C. I was very proud to be. And actually never, up to that point in my life, had owned a car. And because I was in college, and before that, my poor parents had to shuttle me around like most American kids. And then I moved to D.C., and 18 years I got through without having owned one. The downside of that was the forest schools and opportunities outside of the Beltway were not accessible. But moving to Connecticut, overall, my carbon consumption has fallen, but I do drive. But the plus side of that is that I bring my son every Tuesday to a forest school just a town over, where he spends 6 hours a day on Tuesdays in the woods. It doesn't matter if it's pouring, if it's 20 below zero or whatever. They're just out there learning the basics, having fun, and really connecting to the earth.
Well, and as you say, when I read a little bit of the Gaian Creed, I read the first part, which is kind of the part we all know but don't necessarily want to admit, which is what a challenge our earth is having, and we with her. And you then write, therefore we commit to living radically sustainable lives, even to an extent that it may alienate us from our kin, our communities, our cultures. We commit to sharing our philosophy and bringing others to understand and embrace their relationship with Gaia and help heal Gaia, and in the process themselves, their families, and their communities. I mean, there is such an enormous gulf between psychological denial and admittance that what we're facing is colossal. And as you and I and many others think, we're going to have a great loss of population over the coming decades. It's almost unavoidable. And yet there are others who, like our current president and their administration, are rolling back things as primary as the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a disconnect there.
Well, so let's talk about that, because I think that's...
Yeah, we can, absolutely.
Tell us what you think, because I think it's so profoundly at the core of dissociation that we have going on, and until we can get over the dissociation, how are we going to measure up to the task at hand?
Well, the dissociation is twofold. There's the psychological denial piece, where you don't want to believe it. But I think at the policy level, it's something worse than that, right? I mean, our economy, our entire culture is a consumer culture.
Right.
And our economy is based on continued economic growth. It runs on fossil fuels. The idea of transitioning is naive, ultimately. If you're looking from that perspective, and the ideas of, I've written on economic degrowth and the need for that from an ecological perspective. But the pushback constantly is that, our entire banking system depends on inflating currency, which means that we have to keep growing, right? And so that we can depreciate the debt and eventually pay it off, right? It would trigger an economic meltdown if we actually chose to degrow. So, there's this struggle, right? The ecological reality demands degrowth, and yet we are locked in a political and economic reality that demands growth. So they're at loggerheads there. And unfortunately, the environmental community doesn't have billions of dollars to throw around to sway people's opinions on, through Facebook ads and through programming and every other which way, and through lobbying, I should say, and advertising. So it's not surprising that that's what is being communicated.
But there are
to
places...
make one last point on that, actually,
please.
Is that as things get worse, the denial is going to go up more, and people are going to look towards authoritarians who promise that they know how to get out of this. So that gets actually more frightening, because fundamentalists, either of the political or religious nature, are going to get more and more attention, right? So whether that's the new president in Brazil or our own president, people are open to being swayed by leaders who promise that they can fix things.
Right. We're just going to plant trees and that'll do it. We're still going to pollute the air, the water, our food supply, but we're going to plant trees and that'll do it. I think though that this effort that you're working towards, and so many others, when you look to the Scandinavian countries, they have a much greater sensibility about the intricacy of the earth. And Helena Norberg-Hodge, who I'm sure you know, of local economies in Australia, I think she is, or New Zealand now, she used to be in the UK, does such a beautiful job as an organization of showing people the plain facts of why local economy is the answer. There's no mystery as to what we need to do to create resilience, to create the kind of world that will sustain life and deal with the challenges at hand, whether it's flooding or fires or drought or famine, etc., or viruses or biological warfare. I mean, all these things are realities. And to pretend that they're not is just to ignore the reality. So you say that unlike the Western concept of God, Gaia is not all-knowing, all-powerful, or all good. Instead, Gaia is limited in power, in sentience, and is benevolent. In other words, unlike God, Gaia is vulnerable. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to have stated that way.
Thank you. I mean, I think I'm trying to make it clear that, I think my worst fear as I write about this guy in philosophy is that Gaia becomes deified, right? I mean, that's not... God, unfortunately, has led to more conflict and more challenges than healing, I guess. I don't know. That's not exactly the way to say it, but for me, recognizing that the Earth is alive doesn't mean it's a conscious being that we should worship. It means that we have certain rights. It's like ancient Confucian understanding that a parent has rights, expectations, or a child has expectations that the parent will take care of it. But that means he has responsibility or an obligation to care for that parent in old age, right? And that's a kind of the written codified version. That was the indigenous way in the first place, right? The elders weren't shuffled off into nursing homes like we do here, but they were cared for and respected and valued as key sources of knowledge and wisdom. And so, right now we have commodified the earth in the sense that, even the way we talk about it, natural resources and all that, it's very extractive terminology. We don't give it rights. We just kind of see it as an infinite source of goods and energy and all that. And unfortunately, that's not true. And instead, we're polluting it and we're changing it to a degree that it is going to kill us, ultimately.
In your work at Gaianism.org and on your blog, people ask, so what would local Gaian groups do if people got together? And one of the things that you've written about are 4 main purposes of local Gaian groups. And I have this kind of almost fantasy that the communes are going to come back. The communes of the 60s are going to be restored in this country because in some sense it's the most sensible way to live. And co-housing, certainly in Europe and other places, is very highly developed, unlike our own nation. But you said one of the things is reminding us of our grand goal.
Yes, and that is to heal Gaia, ultimately. Right? So if we recognize that we can have ambitions to be an astronaut or a famous painter, all that kind of thing, but if we're doing that outside of the recognition that we also need to, first and foremost, take care of Earth. I mean, we're in a relationship with Gaia, ultimately, whether we see that or not. And it's hard to see, ultimately, at this point, because we grow up in cities, we're in towns, we're not being given access to the outdoors. Nobody is reinforcing those messages, whether on TV or the political leaders, as you noted. They're, in fact, often saying the opposite. So it's not surprising that we don't understand how completely and utterly dependent we are on a living Earth system. But that is, once we understand that, it becomes our obligation to care for and heal it, more than anything else, right? So that's kind of what the point of that.
Mm-hmm. And then you also talk about learning Gaian ways.
Yes, and so ultimately, so there's this Gaian philosophy on the abstract, which is all great and nice, but if people aren't actually kind of living it, locally, then it's just a little virtual hiccup, right? I mean, ultimately, I don't know how long the internet will last, right? I don't know how long this kind of interconnected virtual consumer society can continue, right? I mean, yes, if you have the resources, when the resources become scarce, I'm sure the internet will still be great until we can't afford ecologically to shoot new satellites up in the air. We're going to have great telecommunications for those who can afford it, but there will be many who don't. So I think all living philosophies need to root themselves in the real, not in just the kind of the virtual. And what does that include? That means teaching, basic understanding. It means building a community. It means connecting individuals to the earth again, right? So this is right now still abstract, honestly, because I've been wanting to communicate about this kind of Gaian philosophy for many more years than I have been. I was a little hesitant. I was busy with World Watch. I had lots of excuses, but it was also, truthfully, slightly uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, writing as a philosopher is even weirder than writing as a sustainability researcher.
Yeah.
in this culture. But as I work this through in the spring here in Middletown, I've started to build some relationships, and I'll actually put out a weekly or an invitation to a weekly service, right? Kind of the equivalent of a church service, but not a church service, right? It will be a forest what the Japanese call a forest bathing.
Yeah.
Service, right, where you go out, you quietly listen and connect to the nature, probably on a Sunday morning, and then, but there will still be those elements of church community building, right? The coffee hour afterwards. I'm daydreaming about having a forest Sunday school, right? So a Sunday school where kids can be dropped off, so parents can do the meditation, and the kids are just playing in the woods, doing what my son does on Tuesdays, so that they connect to Gaia as well. Not in a prescriptive way, but just loving Gaia and having fun playing in the woods. So I think those things would help to build the community, and then you can use that community to teach the broader neighborhoods, the environmental living. You can help strengthen the community's own resolve, right? So just 2 weeks ago, I saw that there was a protest at the Capitol in Hartford on the latest on fracking, I think. And I said, I need to bring my son there, and we need to go and join the protest. But I'm an introvert. I hate protesting. And I just, at the end of the day, and I'm ashamed that I didn't, but I didn't go. Right? We found a good excuse, and we didn't.
But
but it just to make the point, if I was in a community and we were all going together and we made the protest signs together and we were carpooling together, I would have been there.
Right.
So sometimes we just need that community support to do the right thing.
No, it's true. I used to do protests. I can't do them anymore. They physically make me ill. Just the crowds, the noise, the anxiety. I don't know. Maybe it's age. I don't know what it is. At 66, I can't do street protesting anymore. I can barely, stay on the front lines about most things. I mean, like 5G. Here they're talking about microwaving the entire planet. And in Europe, they're pretty vocal in their protests. And in this country, we have these lovely little ads about get your data faster and more of it. And without any explanation about, the Internet of Everything and the destruction of the ecosystem and animals and humans with the numbers of arrays of receivers that they're going to have. It's overwhelming. I mean, I feel overwhelmed by the scale of collapse that is happening. And like you and others like us who have been talking about it for decades, and now it's actually happening. It's not just some future scenario. We're in it. People are always waiting for some major meteorite to hit. Well, we're in it right now in ecological collapse. And I don't know what it takes. The younger people seem to be awake to it, but I'm not sure that they yet know how to use their numbers. I hope they get out and vote. That's what I hope. That the first thing I hope they do is vote and at least change the administration. But so coming back to Gaian philosophy and opening our hearts to the love we have for the earth and for each other is sharing Gaian wisdom.
Yeah. And I mean, so ultimately, it's one thing to help a community to be prepared for this transition, to support each other, but if you're not spreading that out there to others, then again, it's just going to be a few people in the woods on a Sunday, right? And it needs to be spread, and there's benefit in spreading it because the people who are aware of what's coming can share that information with others, right? So. Is there a way that we can actually start localizing the economy, creating the local repair cafe or the CSA or other efforts that actually start making the communities in which we live more resilient, as you noted, to whether it's to a hurricane, a forest fire, a global economic downturn. There are challenges already, and they're going to accelerate, and that's not doom and gloom or millenarianism. It's just, that's what happens if you study in a sustainability think tank for, 18 years, right? You see the trends, and now you just need to read the New York Times or any newspaper, and you can see fire after fire and hurricane and the rest of it. Right? This is
exactly
rapid changes. Actually, January was the hottest January on record again. It's it just keeps coming, and it's going to accelerate as we release more CO2 into the environment.
We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Our guest is Erik Assadourian, and I hope you all visit his posts at www.gaianism, ANISM.org. Gaianism after the word Gaia. And don't forget, links to all our guests are posted at 21st21stcenturyradio.com and ZoharaOnline.com, and our audio archives are available for free on iTunes and YouTube.
Hi, I'm C.R. Lawn, and with 40 years' experience in the garden and farm seed trade, I am a board member of the Open Source Seed Initiative, OSSI. You can learn more about our work to keep new seed varieties in the public domain at www.osseds.org. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. In fact, I just read, I think, that the Cherokee seeds have now been put into the Global Bank. What is that, in Norway? Eric, I'm not. Do you know where the Global
Seed Bank is in Norway?
Yeah. So they just
and ironically, it flooded once.
Yeah, I always wondered about that. I said, it doesn't make any sense to me to put the seed bank of the world in one location. That's a pretty quick way to eliminate all the seeds on the planet. But it's really important to. I want to encourage everybody as the spring season approaches in gardening to try to plant as many heirloom plants as you can. Save your own seeds and reuse them the next year, like everybody did in the 30s and 40s in this country. So coming back to Gaianism, GAIANISM.org, after the word Gaia, you talk in your blog also about not just reminding us of our grand goal, which we touched on, learning Gaian ways and sharing Gaian wisdom, but preparing for the transition. Tell us what that looks like from your vantage point.
Well, thank you for really going through this. This is really helpful. But, actually, there's a quote in that essay from Dar Jamal who makes it clear that what we've been talking about, right? Both of us know that the transition is coming, right? And so he says, actually, each one of us, knowing what we now know, must take full responsibility for preparing ourselves for the adaptation required to live on this increasingly warming, melting world as civilizations and societies continue to disintegrate. Right? So we know what's coming at this point, and we have to, not just prepare ourselves, because that's nonsense, right? People who've watched prepper documentaries or reality shows or whatever. It's silliness to think that you can prepare yourself and not prepare your community. In fact, actually, with the coronavirus, one of the essays I wrote recently was just looking at pandemic preparedness. And then not just yourself, right? Unfortunately, people are going off to CVSs around the country and hoarding masks, which in past epidemics has actually led to a scarcity that hurt health workers, right? So, it's not about taking resources and putting them into your closet. It's about building and strengthening your community through community preparedness efforts like that. So could Gaians play an important role, not just in preparing themselves, although that is important. We should learn from the Mormons, as I mentioned, to kind of prepare yourself for those emergency times. But are there skills that we should be having, basic medicine and first aid? Are there community organizations that we can be supporting? Right? So actually, for that essay, I started looking into the CERT program, the Community Emergency Responsiveness Training programs that exist in many communities around the U.S. now. So, how can we as a community support the broader community in getting all of us ready for the transition?
Yeah, which means talking to your local government, your local representatives, your local business people. When we look at all these global international stores or big national chains and the loss of our local stores, and now with Amazon delivery and the small stores closing up because there isn't enough support, this is tragedy in the making. I encourage people to read Local Economies. Laura, do you remember the website, localeconomies.org, I believe it is, to really appreciate the research that's been done already on those communities who are trying to create sustainable networks. It's called localfutures.org. Go to localfutures.org, how important it is. There was, something you quoted from John Lewis, and is this a quote from the politician John Lewis or somebody else?
Yeah, from the politician.
Can I read that?
Sure.
It's beautiful because he's been asked, with the civil rights movement and other things, how do those of us who are awake, aware, and desiring to make a change in preparation for colossal upheaval, and this is real, what do we do? And he said, quote, I discovered that you have to have this sense of faith that what you're moving toward is already done. It's already happened. And you live as if you're already there, and that you're already in that community, part of that sense of one family, one house. If you visualize it, if you can have faith that it's there for you, it is already there. And during the early days of the movement, I believed that the only true and real integration for that sense of the beloved community existed within the movement itself, because in the final analysis, we did become a circle of trust, a band of brothers and sisters, unquote. I mean, it is such wise counsel.
Absolutely. And especially as you're starting something new,
Yeah.
when you feel sometimes like you're writing to yourself, it's really helpful to imagine that the beloved community already exists. Or take from the Quakers, where they say, they draw from the Gospels, which say, wherever there's two or three of us, we are a community. Right? So it's like you don't need a lot of people to create a Gaian group, for example. And in fact, I would share that we have started having, at least online, a monthly conversation on different topics that are related to kind of environmental or Gaian way. So actually the next one is on Wednesday at 7 Eastern over Zoom, right? So if anyone's interested, they can reach out to me through the Gaian website, and I can share the link. But the idea is to start building that beloved community through conversation, through sharing our struggles, sharing our joys, like all communities do, and trying to work together to bring something.
That's lovely. Go to www.gaianism, GAIANISM.org. Earlier this year, Matthew Fox joined me to talk about his Order of the Sacred Earth. And this also a similar notion that communities can be wherever they are and do whatever they do in the name of service to the earth and each other in right human relations. And I thought it was a beautiful addition of moving outside the ecclesiastical infrastructure into just the community at large, to say to everybody, whatever you do can be of value to others.
Absolutely. I hadn't heard of that, but I will take a look.
Oh, you must. You must. Order of the Sacred Earth. It's right down your alley. This would be perfect for you to maybe even graft some of what you do into what they do and what they do into what you do, because they're really trying to do that kind of community building around the world. Are there places, Erik, that you've seen? I mentioned the Scandinavian countries because they always seem to have their heads on right about the earth and the air and the water and, sustainability and community. Are there places in the world where you feel like, yeah, well, these people are pretty hip to what's happening and they're making a difference and they're showing us profitable ways to go for the restoration, like discovering that hemp is so good for the bees and the bee colonies and restoring them?
Yes and no, or no and yes. I'm not sure which. But ultimately, Scandinavia is pointed to often for being the model. But I actually was part of an advisory board for a sustainable consumption project not too long ago, and some of what was researched was so shocking, even for me who studies consumerism and consumption. But ultimately, the amount that we can consume, or more correctly, the amount we have to reduce to actually get within a one planet measurement, right? And within the limits of Earth, are dramatic, right? So even in Finland, which is consuming far less than the U.S., they have to reduce something like 85 or 90%.
Wow.
By 2050, and I think like 70% by 2030. But even places like India have to, averaged out per capita, to be fair, it's not very fair because there are deeply poor individuals and then also very rich. But even on average, Indians even have to reduce 20 or 30% by 2030, or and more by 2050. So we can point to Scandinavia for many things. I mean, their education system is amazing. The equity and distribution of resources is really impressive. The socialized health system is wonderful, but they are still using a lot of ecological capital to make that beautiful human way of life. Mm-hmm. So really, if we're going to be honest and look at an ecological model, political authoritarianism aside, we have to look at a place like Cuba, right? Where I'm not talking about we have to have no freedom or anything like that, but for the way that they distribute resources is quite exemplary, right? So their mortality rates, children and mothers are lower or on par with America, and using a fifth, literally, of the resources, right? So if you look at the education, the access to higher opportunities, free medical school, all that, they're doing something really well, and at a percentage of the resources that we're using. So if that's not to say we need to mimic Cuba, but we need to say, okay, well, what do we really value? Is it education for everyone? Is it the consumer lifestyle, which is not compatible? Is it the ability to move without a car and to actually get around? I mean, we could provide those basic luxuries, public luxuries, in a sense, of transportation, of health, of education, at a relatively low ecological cost if we prioritize them. Unfortunately, we just don't right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, so many of us, millions around the earth, like I mentioned, who have been at this our entire lifetime since we were children, and now our own children and grandchildren are having to contend with what's coming and what's already here. And it is a great challenge to keep yourself balanced. So I really like John Lewis's perspective, which is also by the native medicine men's perspective, when you pray for something, to have gratitude that it's already been done. And I like that because it puts us in that place of, our mind shapes matter. And so if we can shift our consciousness, and it does take daily work to do it, I think, at least it does for me. I have to work at it every day, to have rightful prayer for the world and our neighbors and our family and each other. And so, Erik, I bless you on your journey. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. www.gaianism, GAIANISM.org. That's Gaianism with Erik Assadourian. Follow up with him and see how you can make a difference where you live.
I hope